The truth about Thomas Jefferson they don't teach in school. A man of grand ideas. A leader of contradictions. A figure whose legacy still sparks debate. Thomas Jefferson helped shape the foundation of America. But did he truly believe in the ideals he preached? Or was his vision of freedom only for a select few? Let's dive in. Alright, so Jefferson, the Republican, ran against John Adams, the Federalist, in the election of 1800. And this was no ordinary election. It was the first real political showdown in U.S. history, where both parties actively campaigned. The Federalists had a pretty questionable strategy. Vote for Adams because he's better than you. Shocking no one. That didn't go over too well with voters. Meanwhile, Jefferson and his Republicans pushed a more populist message, appealing to the common man. Now, elections back then worked a little differently. Each elector cast 2 votes, one for president and one for vice president, but the votes weren't distinguished. The idea was that one elector from Jefferson's party would throw away a vote so that Jefferson would have one more than his running mate, Aaron Burr. But someone forgot. So instead of Jefferson winning outright, he and Burr tied in the Electoral College. Per the Constitution, the tie sent the election to the House of Representatives, where things got even messier. It took 36 ballots and the last-minute intervention of Alexander Hamilton before Jefferson finally secured the presidency. Ironically, Hamilton despised Jefferson, but he disliked Burr even more, enough to tip the scales in Jefferson's favor. Jefferson's vision for America was clear. He wanted a nation of independent, self-sufficient farmers. He feared that industrialization would create a corrupt, wage-dependent society that mirrored Europe's class struggles. For him, the ideal American was the yeoman farmer, working his own land, free from government interference. But here's the irony. Jefferson's policies didn't always align with this vision. The man who wrote, "All men are created equal," and yet enslaved more than 600 people over the course of his life. Jefferson's campaign slogan was, "Jefferson and Liberty." But liberty for whom? Certainly not for the enslaved people who built his Monticello estate, cooked his meals, and labored in his fields. And not even for many white men, since only a fraction of them could vote at the time. Now, Jefferson's stance on slavery? Complicated, to say the least. On paper, he called it a moral depravity and a hideous blot on the nation. He pushed for legislation that banned the importation of enslaved Africans and proposed abolishing slavery in new territories. But in reality, he owned over 600 slaves throughout his lifetime and used them to finance his lavish lifestyle. He even profited from the domestic slave trade, which became Virginia's most valuable industry. By the early 1800s, Virginia's most valuable export wasn't tobacco or cotton, it was enslaved people. As the demand for labor in the South grew, Virginia became a hub for the domestic slave trade. Families were torn apart, children were sold away from their parents. And Jefferson? He was right in the middle of it. While he did sign a law in 1807 banning the international slave trade, this did nothing to stop slavery itself. In fact, it made the domestic slave trade even more profitable. Instead of slowing down, slavery boomed, and Jefferson's vision of phasing it out quietly failed spectacularly. And unlike George Washington, who freed his slaves upon his death, Jefferson chose not to. With a few exceptions, his enslaved workers were sold off to pay his debts, tearing apart families in the process. Even more damning, Jefferson wrote racist theories that justified slavery. In his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, he argued that black people were inferior to whites and Native Americans. He believed they lacked the same intellectual capacity and moral reasoning. And yet, he fathered children with an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings. Hemings was at least 30 years younger than Jefferson, and, as his property, she had no ability to consent. Now, while Jefferson and other white elites debated the morality of slavery, enslaved people themselves were not waiting for permission to seek freedom. In 1800, a blacksmith named Gabriel Prosser planned one of the largest slave rebellions in American history. The plan? Storm the Virginia Capitol, take hostages, and demand the abolition of slavery. But before it could happen, word of the plot got out. Gabriel and 25 others were executed. Instead of inspiring change, the rebellion terrified white Virginians, leading to even harsher laws against slaves. It became illegal for enslaved people to gather without white supervision. and it became even harder for owners to legally free their slaves. The message was clear. Slavery wasn't ending, it was becoming more deeply entrenched. So if Jefferson didn't believe slavery could last forever, what was his solution? His idea? Gradual emancipation. But only if freed black people were deported from the U.S. Jefferson believed that black and white Americans could never peacefully coexist. His answer was to colonize freed slaves in Africa or the West Indies. This idea would later inspire the creation of Liberia, a colony meant for freed African Americans. But in Jefferson's lifetime, it was little more than a fantasy. Instead of pushing for actual abolition, Jefferson spent decades clinging to a theory that never materialized. So, here's the paradox. Jefferson wrote the words, "All men are created equal," but spent his life enslaving hundreds of people. He publicly opposed slavery yet refused to take real steps to end it. Even in death, he did not free the majority of his slaves, unlike George Washington, who at least made provisions to do so. Next up, let's take a look at Jefferson's stance on government power. Thomas Jefferson had a grand plan for America, one that looked nothing like the growing industrial powerhouses of Europe. He saw the country as an agrarian utopia, a land of independent farmers living free from the corruption of big cities, manufacturing, and government overreach. To make that happen, he had a simple to-do list. Shrink the government, cut taxes, reduce military spending, pay off national debt, keep America peaceful and out of global conflicts. Sounds great, right? But as history loves to remind us, big plans don't always survive reality. At first, it worked beautifully. Jefferson abolished all internal taxes, except tariffs, got rid of the much-hated whiskey tax, and even started paying down the national debt. He slashed the size of the military, arguing that a big army and navy weren't necessary for a country that wanted to stay out of European wars. But then, foreign affairs came knocking. Enter the Barbary Pirates. These weren't your fun, swashbuckling Jack Sparrow types. They were real pirates terrorizing American ships in the Mediterranean, capturing sailors, and demanding ransom. Without a strong navy, Jefferson suddenly had a choice: stick to his small government ideals or protect American trade. Spoiler alert, he picked war. Jefferson sent warships and marines to fight the pirates, launching the First Barbary War, 1801 to 1805. So much for staying out of conflicts. If pirates weren't enough trouble, Jefferson also ran into a brick wall named John Marshall. Marshall, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was a die-hard Federalist, meaning he loved a strong national government. Jefferson, on the other hand, wanted to strip power away from the Federalists and make government as small as possible. But here's the problem: judges serve for life. So, while Jefferson could replace government officials, he couldn't touch the Supreme Court. Then came Marbury versus Madison in 1803, a case that changed everything. The ruling established judicial review, meaning the Supreme Court could now decide whether laws were constitutional or not. This wasn't even in the Constitution. Marshall and his court basically just gave themselves that power. Which is ironic since Jefferson wanted to limit government power. But this ruling expanded it indefinitely. And then came the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson had always been a strict constructionist. He believed the government should only exercise powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. If it wasn't written in the document, the federal government had no right to do it. But in 1803, an incredible opportunity arose. France, led by Napoleon, offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory for just $15 million. This land deal would double the size of the United States and secure vast resources for future generations. There was just one problem. The Constitution didn't say anything about buying land from foreign nations. Jefferson was now in a dilemma. If he followed his strict interpretation of the Constitution, he would have to pass on the deal. But if he took the land, he would be expanding federal power in a way that went against his own beliefs. In the end, he chose practicality over principle. He justified the purchase by arguing that it aligned with the nation's best interests and secured the vision of an agrarian America by giving farmers more land. With one stroke of the pen, Jefferson doubled the size of the country and ensured its future growth. At the end of the day, Thomas Jefferson was a man of contradictions, just like the country he helped build. He was a revolutionary thinker, but also a man who contradicted his own ideals. He fought for democracy, yet concentrated power. He preached liberty, yet denied it to others. He envisioned an agrarian republic, yet set policies that fueled industrial growth. But maybe that's why he still fascinates us today, because his contradictions aren't just about him. They reflect the contradictions in America itself. The tension between ideals and reality, between words and actions, has shaped the country from the very beginning. So, how should we remember Jefferson? As a visionary, a hypocrite, or something in between? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more. See you next time.